Welcome back. This is part 2 of Module 4, and today we'll be looking at some further aspects of the mythology around Demeter and Hades, at least some of the themes that emerge from the stories that are told around these specific figures, such as the nature of the underworld and the relationship between ancient goddesses and the power of life and death. Now, first, we're going to look at a couple more theoretical perspectives that are relevant to this particular set of myth stories. Now, in the 20th century, as is well known, we saw the rise of a variety of feminist movements that impacted society at many different levels, including scholarship and academic research. Now, one of the interesting byproducts of some of these movements was an interest in ancient goddesses and the phenomenon of goddess worship. So this led to the development of a set of ideas known as goddess feminism, which sets itself against traditional patriarchy and seeks to promote values such as nonviolence and equality. Now, some scholars, in particular the archaeologist Maria Gumbatas, her work was used in a very important way to support some of these modern goddess movements, because in her later publications she argued for the existence of prehistoric matriarchal societies that she argued were peaceful and egalitarian, and she argued that these prehistoric matriarchal societies and women-centered societies were then invaded and overwhelmed by conquerors, tribal groups that were more patriarchal, that would be the Indo-Europeans. So what she's doing is trying to explain a kind of change in social norms and societal values by analyzing archaeological evidence in connection to linguistics and mythological storytelling. Now, many of her later theories were widely criticized as unsupported by archaeological evidence, or some critics argued that she was reading into that evidence. Others have suggested that this was part of a smear campaign to discredit her. But nonetheless, it points to the difficulty with archaeological evidence, which can often be highly subjective. So there's a real danger of value projection and confirmation bias. But nonetheless, her work has continued to inspire people who are wanting to work towards a more egalitarian and female-centric society. Such individuals continue to imagine this idea of a prehistoric society that's like the one that they want to reconstruct today, which they believe would be better for humanity as a whole. So the prehistoric world that Gumbatas imagined serves as a sort of charter for those, or mythic charter for those who were wanting to realize such aspirations. But not everybody agrees that myth stories that feature prominent goddesses and female figures are necessarily empowering. Some might look to the myth of Demeter and Persephone as an empowering story. Others, such as Helen Foley, have seen it in a very different light. She has read such stories as reinforcing patriarchal social roles, in that myth stories encourage women to accept the will of men, especially in marriage. And according to Foley, myths are not typically meant to subvert social values, but in fact to reinforce those values and to underpin the dominant ideology of society. So you have different scholars reading these ancient narratives through very different sort of ideological and methodological lenses. But nonetheless, I think the importance of goddess figures in antiquity is still something that needs to be addressed, especially in terms of how many of these goddess figures converged over time. So we're not talking about the prehistoric period where we don't really have textual evidence of any significance. So we are kind of left to speculate, but we can see in literate cultures from Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Greco-Roman world a number of very interesting goddess traditions that often involve the goddess having some sort of power over life and death, or ability to provide an enhanced afterlife. And some of these, many of these traditions exhibit kind of similar characteristics. There's often a journey to the underworld, or the goddess has a male consort who dies and is then brought back to life, or is dismembered and put back together. And some of the earliest traditions of this sort that we have any literary record of revolve around the Sumerian goddess Inanna, also known as Ishtar. So Sumerian civilization dates back at least to around 5000 BCE and is one of the kind of oldest civilizations in the world. And we have a number of versions of stories that chronicle the journey of this goddess to the underworld. And again, the fact that there's often a kind of resurrection motif in these stories as well has caught the attention of scholars, especially in the 20th century. But like the story of Demeter and Persephone, there is also strong agricultural and fertility dimensions to these myths. Now, in terms of the descent of Ishtar, the versions of this story date back to more than 2,000 years before the Common Era, and many versions of this story were told and preserved on clay tablets that have only been uncovered in the last couple of hundred years in Mesopotamia. But here we have a story of Ishtar going who's again a fertility goddess, going to the underworld. And it says, Ishtar, on arriving at the gate of the land of no return, so that's the underworld, to the gatekeeper thus addressed herself, Gatekeeper, open your gate that I may enter. If you do not open the gate to let me enter, I will break the door, I will wrench the lock, I will smash the doorposts, I will force the doors, I will bring up the dead to eat the living, and the dead will outnumber the living. So Ishtar is presented as somebody with a goddess with enormous power and influence, that she can effectively force the gates of Hades open so that she can pass through. The gatekeeper opened his mouth and spoke to the lady Ishtar. Desist, O lady, do not destroy it. I will go and announce your name to my queen, Ereshkigal. So the gatekeeper becomes alarmed and then seeks to get permission from the Babylonian goddess of the underworld for Ishtar to pass through. Now, as I've already mentioned, this is only one version of many very similar stories that circulated in antiquity, not only in the Greco-Roman period, but into the into late antiquity as well. And you definitely see a process where the different fertility goddesses that exist in more localized ancient cultures, as these cultures come into contact with one another, especially in the Hellenistic period and in the Roman imperial period, there's this process of syncretism whereby different religious and myth traditions are combined together, and new forms of deities are created, or hybrid forms of deities are created. And one of the most powerful gods that emerges from this process is the so-called universal mother. So figures like Aphrodite and Demeter and Cybele and Isis and Ishtar are all combined, and people are starting to say, well, these are just different names for the same kind of ultimate universal mother. And as I mentioned earlier, there's often a close connection between these goddess figures and the mystery religions. So these rituals that people are undergoing to achieve this heightened state of immortality, the goddess, the universal mother, is often seen as a kind of conduit by which these initiates pass, and from whom they receive special knowledge for their improved afterlife. So even if we can say that the speculations about a kind of goddess culture in the prehistoric period are maybe overstated, there certainly was a presentation of a universal goddess in the Greco-Roman world that was extremely powerful and influential. And her worship and stories about her took on many interesting forms. So that's an important phenomenon that we have to recognize in terms of the fluidity of ancient mythology, is that these gods and goddesses become sort of assimilated to one another in response to changing social and political circumstances. It's no coincidence that around the same time that this is happening, ancient societies are moving to a more kind of centralized, hierarchical, imperial model of civilization. So there's this parallel search for a kind of universal deity, but for several centuries, one of the main candidates for this universal deity was the universal mother, known by many different names. We will revisit this figure when we look at some other important goddesses later in the course. So here we have on the last slide what's known as a cylinder seal, one of the important sources of iconography from ancient Mesopotamian cultures are engraved images on cylinders, which could then be rolled into clay to imprint a kind of flat image. So as much as we have textual traditions from those cultures that talk about myth stories and beliefs in various deities, there is an important component of iconography that is communicated through these cylinder seals, which are also, some of which also contain texts, but also give us a kind of visual language and repertoire for Mesopotamian mythology, which, as I said in the past when we were looking at the flood stories, it's certainly well established today that the religious and mythological traditions of ancient Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean world were not in isolation. They were interacting with one another and influencing one another in important ways. So that's part of the process that contributes to this development of the idea of the universal goddess.